Hey YouTube, I want to kind of cut it right into it and talk about the Dying Light kind of controversy and really backlash regarding Dying Light 2. So Techland, which is the creator of Dying Light 1, decided to create a tweet for their marketing campaign for Dying Light 2, talking about how it takes 500 hours to complete the game. Uh, in response to this tweet that happened January 8th at 12 p.m., they made a clarification talking about how the game is about a 100% completion rate with regards to this 500 hour time frame that they gave, and that there will be a lot of games for that, like a lot of story and side quests for them to complete, and it will be a solid experience. In response to this, which was clarified an hour later, they decided 2 more hours later, actually 2 days later, on January 10th, to make a clarification again, saying that it'll take 20 hours for them to complete the main story, 80 hours for them to complete players to complete the main story and all the side quests, and 500 hours to essentially 100% everything in this game. So what I want to talk about this and what I want to bring it up, because I think that this is a very interesting marketing strategy that Techland is implementing, and I also think that the responses that come from Twitter and outlets is a very interesting one that kind of neglects to highlight a very important part of our video gaming experience that a lot of people don't really realize. So before we look at kind of analysis and kind of look at some of the responses and opinions of like what other people are kind of saying about Dying Light 2 and kind of this 500-hour time frame, I want to say up front that I have not played Dying Light 1 beyond like an hour of the initial game. It wasn't my type of game. I never really had any intention of going back, and I have no intention going and playing Dying Light 1 at any point in time. So I have no vested interest in trying to defend Techland or their marketing stunt, and I have no vested interest in shitting on the game either. It's kind of more so I want to make this video talking about kind of the differing opinions and why they differ in the first place. And it's more and kind of critiquing their marketing strategy and um, why it's so important for them to announce 500 hours and why they stuck to it for that matter, because they continue to stick through it even till the end, 3 days before the game releases. So to start off, I want to talk about Kotaku really quick. Kotaku by Zach Zywin, he talked about Dying Light 2 will take 500 hours to fully complete, and I'm already so tired. Now, just a little critique about Kotaku, I guess, is that they talked about this being the sequel to a 2018 game. It's actually a 2015 game. It's a 7-year game. It's been out for 7 years. It's coming on 8 years. And he kind of talks briefly about it's 500 hours. I feel tired already. Blah blah blah. For a lot of people, that would take a lot of hours. Blah blah blah. So on and so forth. There was a clarification tweet he talked about, but he highlights something really important that I think is a super, I think it misses the point in general, because he talks simply about, I know young Zach, who didn't have a lot of money, could only get a few games a year, would be very excited for a single game that offers 500 hours of gameplay. Older Zach is just too tired. While the 500 hours stat is a bit terrifying, I'm still excited to play more Dying Light 2 after I got a chance to play the preview build last year. So, why is that so important? It's super important because when we look at games over the era of our lifespan and how much games has changed, the medium and kind of the complexity of our games has increased tremendously. We are going from games that kind of you can sink in hundreds of hours into something like a Super Mario, and now it's no longer just jumping and hitting blocks all the time, and now it's games like Assassin's Creed and Dying Light that can put in hundreds of hours into that. And a lot of those opinions that people have, that not only Zach and other people on Twitter, a lot of their opinions come from, is simply because been able to create games that have ranged from hours from completion hours from 2 hours to as high as 100 hours, with varying and more complex gaming systems and mechanics and content that's all really diverse in that sense. And a lot of people take pride in the challenge of taking 500 hours and beating a game versus people who are not really that keen on completing a game in 500 hours. That diversity in opinion is super important because when it comes down to it, the simple answer is gamers play a lot of shit differently. You have a lot of people who are not interested in playing a game for longer than a couple minutes or a couple matches. I mean, with the era of multiplayer games being so prevalent right now, game matches can last between 20 to 30 minutes versus other games that take a lot more of a time commitment in order to complete. So when we look at this, we obviously have a disparity with the way that users are playing games, simply because we're going from games that are like Call of Duty and your kind of pick up and play games, which are kind of your 20-30 minute bursts. Battle Royale is a huge genre right now that commits to like an hour per match or something, roughly, depending on how fast you play. But that kind of disparity is super important, and I think that's where a lot of the opinions that people kind of outlandishly have about this 500-hour completion time is coming from, because you have so many people who are either in the camp of, hey, I can beat a game in 500 hours and I can really squeeze the game for what it's worth, versus a lot of people who are like, that's way too much time in order to experience what is essentially the entirety of the game. I want to say with both of those camps that there's a really interesting thread that came out from Steven Totila. I believe that he is a co-author for Axios, so yeah, I think he covers video games. But he talks simply about how the completion rate, like we're talking the achievement rate for people completing a game completely, is about a 22% for a game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, in which everybody on Game Pass, 22% that got on Game Pass, completed the whole story. And then he talks about how the percentage clearing for the acclaimed 4-hour unpacking, which is the game length 4 hours, was about 24% on Game Pass. Jason Schreier corrected him in saying, not corrected him, but added in that 64% of Steam players have the unpacked achievement. So Steam has a little bit more of a higher completion rate. He then adds on to that, which I think is a huge important aspect of it, is that 50%, roughly 50% of people have completed both Ratchet & Clank and God of War to completion. And these stats are super important because while there's a huge disparity in the amount that people play, like the form of game that they play with regards to something like Call of Duty and Animal Crossing, which have two wildly different completion rates or hours played for that matter. Animal Crossing players can play hundreds of hours and still play a lot of games, and the same is for people who play Call of Duty or Battle Royales and stuff like that, or roguelikes for that matter, have such a wild amount of completion hours that a game might be able to take. And a lot of these games, even for that matter, have essentially infinite amount of hours depending on how much you enjoy a game for that matter. When it comes down to it, the most simple explanation is really the fact that everybody plays games so differently. But I think it's the biggest one to unpack when we look at kind of the way that people are consuming their games. When you look back at Dying Light, and this is Steam chart, so we're looking at stats from Steam chart for Techland's original Dying Light, and we have an all-time peak of like 45,000, and in 24 hours we've had 10,000 players playing Dying Light, with 8,000 playing in the last hour. I mean, over the lifespan of Dying Light being on Steam from back in 2015, this game has been sitting between 3,000 to as high as 22,000 to as high as 30,000 to its December 2021 peak of 21,000. Clearly, people enjoy Dying Light. I mean, a lot of these fall off. There's probably a recurring amount of players that are talking about this game and really conversing about it and really playing it and squeezing their money's worth. And I think it's really important to highlight that for a lot of people in this modern day age is that there are a lot of people who will pump in a lot of time into just one game. I know I'm someone who has 200 hours in Risk of Rain 2. I have as high as 3,000 hours in Dota 2. For a lot of people, there's probably people who put hundreds and hundreds of hours into Stardew Valley and Animal Crossing. And clearly there's a lot of people who still put a lot of time into Dying Light and they still enjoy the game for what it's worth, because that's the kind of era we've jumped into with regards to digital gaming. Like, there is no longer a single, or there's no longer a multiple set of games that we can play simply because it's 20 minutes long or 30 minutes long. While we still have that in the indie scene, where there's a lot of smaller games that people can play for a couple hours here and there, or maybe 20-30 minutes that they can enjoy, and we can kind of get a small slice of the experience and then kind of move on. And that's definitely possible. I think that there's a good medium for both, in having smaller experiences that are really, really focused in on one thing, and more extended experiences that have a lot more oomph to them, or more content. I think that's a good medium for both of them. But I want kind of to highlight the main difference, which is that we live in a world in the gaming industry right now where you can have these kind of wildly varying experiences, and we've kind of built a tolerance level for both of these kinds of things, for both smaller focused experiences to something a little bit more expansive. As someone who has spent hundreds of hours speedrunning a game, what's to say that something for me that is like a focused experience that really only takes 2 hours, how did I squeeze out a 2-hour experience and extend it into 80? Consumers and gamers really min-max a lot of the fun out of games, quote unquote. Like, a lot of developers like to say like they min-max the fun out of it, and to some extent, as a game developer, that is true. That the consumers do kind of min-max a lot of the mechanics to make things kind of easier, or they find tricks to like really beat the game faster or make it easier for themselves. I mean, it's kind of a natural inclination as a game developer to kind of expect those types of things. But on that same coin, we have a lot of people who find the little things really, really enjoyable. And there are a lot of people who don't find that enjoyable, and that simply comes from the fact that there is a huge width and breadth of consumers who are consuming games at wildly different rates. And that's the point that I want to kind of highlight. Techland is looking at this kind of marketing strategy for 500 hours, and they're targeting it to the subset of people that are still playing Dying Light 1, who are still enjoying the game, who are still 10,000 people still playing Dying Light. Dying Light 2 is looking at this marketing strategy as a positive for them. It's why they want to go as far as to clarify, hey, we have 500 hours. Now, mind you, they could have done a little bit better with regards to maybe, making this a little bit of a better, like they should have maybe sat down and realized what they were trying to say and who they were targeting it for in their initial tweet. Instead of saying like 500 hours to complete the game, they should have said like 500 hours to 100% complete the game before they decided to tweet this. But the tweet still stands as it is, which is they are marketing to the subset of people who still play Dying Light 1. they want to market it to the subset of people who are still enjoying the game and really want to squeeze the game for what it's worth, right? And that's a really important marketing strategy because you're targeting people who are kind of diehards of your games who really will consume it at a higher rate than most other people. They won't just pick it up, so a lot of them might complete it. And you know, when you look at these kind of 22%, 50%, and even the rates of which people are still playing the game, it's got a huge boon of people that came in playing it because of Dying Light 2 in the last last year, considering that COVID happened, and you know, there's a huge boost of people, 30,000, 26,000. Like, these are important numbers that Techland is very aware of, and they're kind of wanting to peel people off of the original Dying Light to say, hey, you can get the same amount of enjoyment for Dying Light 2. That is really important. And I think a lot of people who were tweeting in opposition to that 500 hours didn't realize that the game wasn't marketed for them, and they decided to make like their opinions about it and talk about how, hey, you know, this is way too much to complete a game. But the biggest thing is that Techland isn't marketing to those people, right? Like, they're very aware of how many people have Dying Light 1. You know what I mean? They're very, very aware of this. And so a lot of those people kind of maybe either played a couple hours of Dying Light 1 and was like, oh, that was really fun, whatever, and like, you know, they didn't realize that like this wasn't marketed to them. Now, mind you, Techland could have done a little bit better in their pre-marketing strategy to like clarify this in the first place, in order to not confuse people. But for them, any press is good press for their game, no matter how you look at it. So really, when it comes to it, they still win no matter what. But the biggest thing is that like people will play this game for that 500 hours. People will play it beyond the 500 hours. I mean, I've done it. A lot of other people have played games they really love to beyond its completion, and that's it. That's where they're marketing these kinds of things. It's simply because people play it differently, and you know, their reclarification on that is, I think it's part of, like, obviously it's part of their marketing strategy to like tell people like, hey, you know, if you still want a smaller experience, you can definitely get it in that 20 hours to complete the main story. But you know, I don't think it's in Dying Light or even Techland's prerogative to even like try to correct themselves if they don't want to, simply because people will bounce off this game. Like, people will play this game and they'll bounce off, and that's okay. Like, people are gonna buy it and just bounce off of it, and it's just not gonna work. People are not gonna have the same kind of commitment to games the same way. There's such a huge genre shift across the entire medium of indie games and AAA games that you can just play whatever you want and be okay with that. And I think a lot of people kind of forget that you can just kind of play whatever you want and not have to have kind of a strong opinion about some franchise or some game that, quite frankly, you might not even play in the first place. And, you know, as a closing thought, mostly to this whole kind of video that I actually want to talk about, I read somewhere that a game developer talked about, you know, if you have a game that plays well in 4 hours, then make it 4 hours, and don't try to like pad out the game or pad out the content, because in that 4 hours, if that's your main experience and it works in that 4 hours, then do it. And I do agree with that, but I also want to amend it and say that if you are smart enough, if you're a dev who is smart enough, especially with a team like Techland, and you're a company that has the resources to make a game with that extra content, with that extra 500 hours of content, and you think you can make it enjoyable, then do it. Because there's only one way to kind of figure out if that's going to be enjoyable for the player base, and that's simply when they play it. And if it doesn't work, well, it doesn't work. You know, a lot of the time, you know, we look at games like the Assassin's Creed series, which has increased in length and increased in padding and stuff like that. And you know, there's clearly where there's a pushback to definitely games that pad out their content, because who wants to play a game that gets samey over a long period of time? But I think if you're confident enough if Techland is confident enough in making that 500 hours enjoyable and making it something worthwhile, then I think that they should go for it. Um, because no matter what, even if I think personally that, you know, games of this length are maybe a little too much, especially if they're not enjoyable, and the only way I can find out is by playing it. There are people who are, despite that, are gonna be playing these games for that expected amount of time, for that 500, maybe double that, 1,000 hours, 2,000 hours. You know what I mean? They're gonna play this kind of stuff, and it's gonna be for them, even if it's not for me. It's gonna be for them. So yeah, I think that that's kind of like wraps up kind of my talk about kind of why Techland even did this in the first place. I think it's a really interesting. I think it's a really interesting marketing strategy. I feel like Twitter maybe blew up a little too much about this, and I think gaming outlets kind of missed the point that this wasn't marketing to them. But yeah, I think Techland has a good head on their shoulders. Hopefully, Dying Light 2 does well. Guys, thanks so much for listening to me kind of rant on for a little bit about Techland. Enjoy yourselves. Have a great January.